Coming up on White Men Can't Work.
Some form of mass hysteria, mass psychosis.
We could only hire someone if it wasn't a white or Asian man.
A 5-part podcast and YouTube series giving voice to what it's truly like for men in today's DEI-driven workplaces.
I was actually shaking earlier.
We're not having another man be the new head.
I didn't want to leave the house.
Defending white people, I would have thought you were crazy.
Even now, Simon struggles to make sense of what he experienced.
I find it hard sometimes to explain exactly what went on the course to people who weren't on it, because it was almost as if this kind of slightly cultish atmosphere in a way that feels sometimes quite hard to describe, and it was constantly there.
Simon isn't his real name. His voice has been altered. If you're watching on YouTube, you're seeing an AI avatar deliver his actual words. Like many of the men in this series, he's asked for anonymity. The course that Simon struggles to make sense of was a 3-year doctorate in clinical psychology, funded by Britain's National Health Service, training our next generation of frontline therapists. Simon plans to help young people with psychosis. But one day, early on in the course, something happened outside a convenience store 4,000 miles away.
There was a letter that went around the department saying, please, white people, whilst George Floyd happened, lots of people were in mourning. Don't try and facilitate conversations you're not welcome to be a part of. Your black colleagues are suffering. Don't show sympathy and don't show your emotions because they might not be welcome. Being a white man on the course felt both something that I was scared to be, scared to know how I was going to be accepted, but I also didn't feel like I had any room to state that. I still remember the looks that I was given, for asking questions.
Late spring 2020, a moment of profound racial reckoning. When a white police officer murdered George Floyd, caught on camera for the world to see, it ignited global outrage. Something shifted. His death became a generational opportunity to roll back racism, to harness the worldwide outpouring of anger, shame and knee-taking solidarity, to shape the big companies and institutions desperate to do, or be seen to do, something. But the radical activism that had been building and bubbling away since the 1970s finally had its golden opportunity too. The contagion was about to go global. In episode 3 of White Men Can't Work, with me, Tim Samuels, how the death of George Floyd became the moment DEI exploded.
It was already making its mark, but the George Floyd thing gave it, superhuman power. Right? It turned it into... It hulked out, if you will, right? And it became this monster, this green monster, because there's a lot of envy going on here.
A green monster with a divisive ideological agenda that was suddenly given the red carpet treatment by our biggest companies.
I think this gave carte blanche to some people because they said, well, this is evidence of systemic racism in the US. The incident was a horrific incident, but it's one incident. That means that the systemic racism, it's not clear.
Unleashing an agenda where being a man can now be a liability.
It may well be that sometimes there will be a white male who is qualified for the job but gets turned down for non-meritocratic reasons. I was once approached to apply for a board position because I was told that the board needed more non-white faces. That's extremely insulting.
We give voice to some of those men who say they've been sidelined.
The head of HR at the school, standing in the middle of the office, said loud and proud, "One thing is for sure, we're not having another man be the new head."
This is how the world's largest companies had a moment to really make a much needed difference and totally blew it. That's on White Men Can't Work, a podcast series that's also on YouTube. If you're watching, do please click on that subscribe button. Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin kept his knee on George Floyd's neck for more than 8 minutes and 15 seconds, even after he calls out for help, even after he loses consciousness. A brutality, an indifference to human suffering that sent a chill through black communities around the world. Professor Eric Smith in Pennsylvania.
It's heartbreaking, it's gut-wrenching. To see this person calling out for his mother, that's something you don't forget.
Monica Moore, a medical student in Rhode Island.
At that time, I personally became so desensitized. I think I tried to disassociate so that I could not become so angry, because things like that just make me so upset because I can't do anything. It just spoke on a level of exhaustion that I personally have. I think I've seen it in my community, but I've also just seen it within myself. It's just tiredness of when is this ever going to stop, or who will it be next?
Lee Chambers, a business psychologist in Lancashire.
So my immediate emotional reaction was, I hate to say it, but in some ways not surprised. In a sad reality, there are many Black Americans who've been killed in very similar circumstances. Obviously, the very kind of emotive nature of him saying he couldn't breathe is harrowing.
After processing the incident, Lee, who advises companies on inclusion and leadership, allowed a smidgen of hope to creep in. Maybe George Floyd could be a wider turning point for society and companies.
And yeah, I'm not going to lie, Tim, I looked at it with curiosity, a bit of suspicion, but also maybe a little bit of naive optimism that it might actually create some change. And I think change sometimes does come from opening up a conversation and creating a space to do that. I feel that it became something that had to be brought to the table in a way that hadn't given time for reflection on how to do that effectively.
Time to reflect. That wasn't something the big corporations took. Overnight, the death of George Floyd became not just more evidence of police racism, but proof of whole societies riven by racial intolerance. As the head of Coca-Cola told staff, simply put, America hasn't made enough progress. Corporate America hasn't made enough progress, and nor has the Coca-Cola company. Well, not in the 20 years since Coke paid out $192 million in the largest ever race discrimination settlement. Companies fell over themselves to rush out plans and pledges. A $100 million racial equity and justice initiative from Apple, $400 million from PepsiCo, whilst increasing black managerial representation by 30%. A $1 billion from Bank of America Corps to strengthen economic opportunities in communities of colour. Symbolic gestures soon followed. MasterCard's Day of Solidarity. L'Oreal posted, "Speaking out is worth it." Lego paused advertising for toys that feature the police. At London Business School, Professor Alex Edmonds, something of an expert on purposeful business, looked on with more than a dollop of scepticism.
I think a lot of big companies claimed to be very upset about this and they condemned it. Now, I think it was extremely bad what happened. I'm an ethnic minority myself. I feel racism is a very serious issue. It's not clear to me that CEOs should necessarily take a stance on that. A CEO's job is to run his or her company really, really well. Maybe the response to this is to recognize, do we have racism within our firm, and let's try to stamp this out. But to have a public statement about this is strange.
Do you think there was a sense of panic amongst big companies after George Floyd? An urgency descended, the need to do something to respond to social media, the public, shareholders?
Yes, I think there was the need. So they felt they needed to say something. If you contrast that with the Coinbase CEO, and this wasn't specifically about George Floyd, but just general societal issues, he said, I'm not going to take a stance on these issues. So I think this gave carte blanche to some people because they said, well, this is evidence of systemic racism in the US. The incident was a horrific incident, but it's one incident, and this was within the police force. Does that mean that there's systemic racism within corporate America? Not necessarily. Now, there could still well be systemic racism within corporate America, but George Floyd didn't have direct bearing on that.
Companies had to cash the checks they were rapidly writing. Not just the billions being pledged, but the promises to root out any racism in their companies, educate staff, change supply chains, hire and promote minorities. Some HR departments had already been doing this sort of thing. particularly after those mega payouts for sex and race discrimination in the late 90s, early 2000s. Indeed, Starbucks had closed all 8,000 stores for a day in 2018 to give its staff racial bias training. But a mass of companies in the US, Britain and elsewhere suddenly, urgently needed help to draw up race policies to educate millions of staff. And there, ready and waiting after all these years, was DEI, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, an off-the-shelf programme ready to go. What these companies were reaching for wasn't always just HR niceties. There was a radical ideology too, born out of early 70s anti-Westernism. Professor Eric Smith.
Yes. There were well-meaning people, and there was something else going on. There were well-meaning people who wanted to do something about this tragedy, right? And the ongoing tragedy of racism. They sincerely wanted to do things about that and looked to the quote-unquote experts for, guidance on what to do. And they got some bad advice. There are also people out there who, because of the critical social justice ideology, want to use this to kind of topple civilization and build something that they would like to see, something more socialist, right? So they didn't let a good crisis go to waste.
You may have heard the terms critical race theory or critical social justice. I'll let Professor Eric Smith explain this one.
Critical race theory, well, let's start with critical social justice. Critical social justice basically says that society is made out of oppressors and oppressed. These are immutable qualities, and in order to change this dichotomy, the system has to change. There's a systemic oppression throughout the system. Now, CRT is that applied to race. Critical gender studies is that applied to gender. But ultimately, it's oppressor versus oppressed, how that manifests, and the fact that we need to change society as a whole to get rid of it.
And this is directly rooted in Marxism?
It comes out of a Marxist think tank called the Frankfurt School. And it's often called cultural Marxism because it's not about economics necessarily. What they take from Marxism is the framework, the oppressor-oppressed, the bourgeois proletariat, right? It's by analogy Marxist, more than anything.
And if you subscribe to this worldview and you're wearing these critical race, critical justice goggles, how do you see the world when you walk around?
You see it as a constant battle between oppressor and oppressed.
DEI draws heavily from this critical social justice worldview. So, in essence, after George Floyd, some of the biggest capitalist entities in the world threw out the welcome mats and handed over power to an offshoot of Marxism.
It was already making its mark, but the George Floyd thing gave it, superhuman power. It hulked out, if you will, right? And it became this monster, this green monster, because there's a lot of envy going on here.
Ideologies have a tendency to simplify, to see the world through one prism. And so this messy, nuanced, multifaceted world of racial and gender opportunity that straddles class, education, parenting preferences gets reduced to one metric. Professor Alex Edmonds at London Business School.
What does DEI stand for? It stands for diversity, equity and inclusion. But what is implemented is demographic diversity. So that's not diversity. There's many other aspects of diversity, such as cognitive diversity and socioeconomic diversity. There's also equity and inclusion, which is not just to hire a mix of people, but to make sure that they feel valued, that they're able to speak out. And in fact, a lot of the companies which claim to be leaders in DEI, and actually a lot of the thought leaders who post a lot on DEI, are very intolerant about different viewpoints.
It's all about those oppressed v oppressor dynamics, giving power to the demographics that DEI deems have been oppressed.
And we should consider some diversity characteristics, but there's also lots of other characteristics we should consider. To believe that every Asian person is discriminated against that's not necessarily true. That they could be offset by the fact that they were born into a wealthy family, went to some great schools, and have a great network. And so just to reduce the complexity of a person to just their demographic characteristics, I think is quite reductive.
What your age is, DEI barely gives ageism a look in. Whether you've come from a working class background, what your personal struggles have been, what you believe in, none of that real life stuff gets a look in the race and gender targets and quotas being rushed out. And if you think some of this DEI wasn't ideological, it's telling that a number of DEI leaders have been sanctioned for anti-Semitism. Google had to sack its head of diversity after comments surfaced where he'd written that Jewish people had an insatiable appetite for war and killing. The head of diversity at Google. In this perverse, critical race view, Jews have been classified as oppressors. 4,000 years of relentless persecution doesn't cut the Marxist mustard. The E in the middle of DEI has a lot to answer for. Who can argue against genuine diversity or meaningful inclusion? That E, though, stands for equity, not equality. To achieve equity of outcome means targets and quotas. To rapidly change a company's demographics, it means a threat to meritocracy.
There are investors with guidelines who will vote against directors or vote against the not chair or the nominations committee if gender diversity or ethnic diversity on a boardroom is not above a particular level. And so what that means is that we don't look at a director's credentials. All we look at is, do they satisfy particular diversity metrics? But right now, it may well be that the biggest driver. I know that executive search consultants who might be searching for, say, a new CEO, they will give their credentials to potential boards by saying, here are the last few searches that we did, and this was the number of men and the number of women on our shortlist. And that's problematic. That is not only bad for your current client because you're not giving them the best shortlist, but it also means that in the future, how you're hired is not based on your ability to recruit the best people. It doesn't take any skill just to hire, just to have a shortlist which is ethnically or gender diverse. You can get a computer to do that.
Alex puts things in football, soccer terms for me. Back to the less than woke 1970s, when more teams began to sign black players, not because of any tokenism.
They just wanted the very best people. And at the time, that meant white and black players. That didn't mean Chinese players or Indian players. And I don't think Chinese and Indian football fans were asking for them to be represented in the football team. They just wanted the best team. I was a season ticket holder for many years, one of probably the few Asian faces on the terraces. I just wanted the best possible team. I didn't feel I needed to be represented. I wanted my team to be successful. But nowadays, I think things are somewhat different in that we are wanting to hire people to meet particular quotas. And that can be a concern for a number of reasons. It may well be that sometimes there will be a white male who is qualified for the job but gets turned down for non-meritocratic reasons. Or number two, it will be a minority gets the job and fully deserves it. And then they might be concerned that people think, well, they got this because of a quota, particularly if that quota is publicly announced or if the CEO's pay is tied to DEI metrics. And so it was important to recognize that some people who express concerns about diversity initiatives, if not properly executed and implemented, are not just the quotes white men who want to protect themselves, but some of the minorities, such as me, who these initiatives are trying to help. I was once approached to apply for a board position because I was told that the board needed more non-white faces. I thought that's extremely insulting. They made nothing about my credentials or my ability to contribute to the board. It was as if this was a box-ticking exercise so that they could look better when they were just displaying on their website the board members.
In the wake of George Floyd, corporate America embraced DEI, and especially that E in the middle, with gusto. Bloomberg found in 2021, the first year after Black Lives Matter protests, the S&P 100, the 100 biggest companies in the US, had 323,000 workers. 94% of these jobs went to people of colour. A long overdue reckoning, a DEI champion might say. The patriarchy needed smashing through positive discrimination, and so be it if some white men are collateral damage. That thinking, though, surely relies on these blunt schemes actually working, actually making things better for women and minorities, which we'll dive into in the next show. And this isn't a total whinge fest. In the last episode, we'll come up with effective alternatives to DEI. But what that reckoning does mean for many guys is being white and male seem to be career negatives, even to the extent that the law is being flouted. Employment lawyer Adrian Scotland represented Chaz Bayfield, the ad exec we heard from in the first episode, who was unfairly dismissed. Since taking on Chaz's case, he's come to see the tools being used to drive diversity.
I remember speaking to, probably early 2019, speaking to some executive recruiters, headhunters for executive roles in financial services industry. And they said that when they put forward candidates for a role, they would grade them on a star rating, 1 to 5 stars. And the way that they worked is if they had anything less than 4 stars, they probably wouldn't put a candidate forward for consideration. If they had a 4-star candidate, they would typically consider they were a long shot. And then the 5-star was someone who was a perfect fit for the role, that had a decent chance of being employed. And they said to me that if they put forward a 5-star male CV and a 4-star female CV, that 100% of the time the female would get the job. Top executives at these organisations, they would sometimes see as much as 20% of their bonuses based upon this drive to put women in senior roles. But I think when you attach such a strong financial incentive to something, people will look to cut corners, and it's not that they're creating new roles for women, they are taking men out of those roles in order to make space for women.
Is that legal?
No, it's not. There are very limited circumstances in which it might be legal in practice. Usually there is a stronger candidate for a role, and so to just hire someone because they're a woman, or to just fire someone because they're a man, that's not lawful.
How widespread do you think it is? Do you think a sizable number of men are being shunted out of their jobs, or not getting jobs that they are eligible for?
Yeah, I think it's very widespread as far as the larger corporations are concerned, larger employers. There are plenty of companies out there that consider themselves to be above the law. If they've got an ideological basis for pursuing something, they will take those risks, and particularly if there's a financial incentive to do so as well.
It goes back to that sense of conviction, the moral certainty of those pushing DEI. Sod what the law says, sod men having equal protection, they've got a righteous agenda to roll out. Whether being unlawfully treated or not. Just how negative is it to be a man in today's workplace? Well, the head of the multinational insurance company Aviva said no white man could be hired for a senior job without her personal sign-off. A recruiter told me the one group she struggles to place in jobs are white men over 50. And men from across different sectors have been in touch to, anonymously, share their experiences. Pete is a DIY company.
My story is one of being slowly but surely squeezed to a position of guilt and worthlessness because I am a white middle-aged male.
James, a teacher.
The head of HR at the school, standing in the middle of the office, said loud and proud, "One thing is for sure, we're not having another man be the new head."
Mark, in financial services.
I have been rejected for being considered for job roles because the client has expressly asked for all female lists. All I want is to be treated fairly. Men like me are not. It's no surprise so many men take their lives in their 40s and 50s. I had a go too. Thankfully, I was stopped before things got out of hand.
Yes, just subjective snapshots of some men's experiences, but it's supported by the polling we've commissioned by JL Partners to reveal the true scale of what men are experiencing these days. They questioned more than 800 white men across the UK and found more than a third, 36% of white men under 34, say they'd lost out on a promotion or work opportunity directly because of their gender or race. That's a significant proportion. These are young guys in their 20s at the start of their careers who've probably only had the chance to apply for the odd promotion so far, but have already been thwarted because they're white guys. Nationally, the data shows more than 6 million white men of all ages say they've been denied a career opportunity thanks to DEI. In the US, that would equate to 30 million men. A similar proportion of men, 34%, say that white men are now the least valued workers in their workplace. Amongst 18 to 24-year-olds, that rises to 41%. So what if some men are feeling victimised? In fact, one of DEI's leading thinkers, Robin DiAngelo, has said, "It is white people's responsibility to be less fragile." All humans are fragile though. Just look at men's mental health or addiction figures. No one wants to be the victim of discrimination, even if it's supposedly fixing other discrimination. Fragile things also snap. Broken men fuel populism. And isn't there more than one way to tackle ingrained racism or sexism that reflects the melting pot of the society we live in, but doesn't just see the world through the prism of oppressed and oppressor ledgers to even out? Eric Smith, Professor of Rhetoric at York College of Pennsylvania, faced down some heavy-duty racism as a kid.
You don't have to be too creative when you're trying to insult a black person. There are several words that are kind of common knowledge, right? There's a lexicon of hate, and they just chose from that list. So it wasn't too difficult.
I mean, I guess not everyone has your resilience or your attitude.
No.
Because of that, do you think that some people do need, I guess let's call it positive discrimination, to allow them to live up to their potential because they need that leg up that you perhaps didn't need because you were just pulling yourself up?
If I understand your question correctly, you're asking if certain people of color need to kind of demonize white people to feel better about themselves?
Whether certain people of color should be given positive discrimination to allow them to get into college.
Oh, affirmative action.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I'm not a big fan of affirmative action. I think there are other ways of helping downtrodden or traditionally or downtrodden people, like outreach programs, things like that, extracurricular programs to help students catch up and things like that. There are other ways of doing that without throwing merit out the window and fulfilling a quota.
Just the kind of nuanced thinking which really lands in today's polarised world.
As a black guy speaking out against this, what's been the reaction to you?
I was called a white supremacist.
Right.
And
just to clarify, if you shift the camera to the right, is there a hood there?
No, there's not. There's not a hood there at all. It's in the cleaners, actually. I'm picking it up later today. But no, seriously. I was called a white supremacist. I was called, a self-hating black person, when in reality, it's as clear as day that if anybody's self-hating, it's the people who are demanding that you make the test easier for the black kids. You have black mass. You have
what
you have black ethnomathematics. You haven't heard of that one?
Tried not.
Black kids learn math differently, so you got to teach them differently. You can't teach them like the white kids.
Okay,
that's the thing.
Is there anything in that?
Of course not.
Eric isn't the only one being accused of white supremacy. The activist form of DEI isn't just about getting more women and minorities into roles. It's an ideological, Marxist-fueled fervour to roll back the tide of oppression, to dismantle what's decried as whiteness. Coca-Cola employees were presented with a Confronting Racism webinar which asked staff to try to be less white, which, according to the Robin DiAngelo slides that were being shown, meant being less oppressive, arrogant, certain and defensive. Employees were also told, in the US and other Western nations, white people are socialised to feel that they are inherently superior because they are white. Koch went on to pull the course from its Better Together initiative, but others are still rallying to dismantle so-called whiteness. At his NHS-funded course training clinical psychologists to work in the health service, Simon and his class were presented with a whole day dedicated to whiteness, which, like much of the ideology being imported post-George Floyd, makes no mention that Britain and America have deeply different racial histories and attitudes. I've seen a presentation from that day which describes whiteness as an invisible racial ideology, and twice mentions the term eugenics, the sort of selective breeding to form a master race that Hitler was so fond of. How's that being taught to anyone, let alone health professionals?
The thesis was kind of like, we call whiteness is a sort of an ideology, is what she would call it in herself. Something perpetuated by people in a position of power, almost suggesting that what we do as individuals is wake up in the morning and a white man, think, how can I best progress the sort of the power base of other white men like me, heteronormative men like me, and anyone putting their hand up to sort of say, are the limitations on this, which I did do, it would be looked at as kind of like, why have you, white man, got a problem with talking about white men having power? And there's that feeling of being on your own, and that maybe I am going mad, or maybe I am a racist, or maybe I have got something that I'm missing to not really be going along with this stuff. There was a white girl on the course who put her hand up and said, I think sometimes it's useful for people to be talking about their own cultures, and we don't need necessarily more white men to be telling us about cultures they don't belong to. And I remember thinking, is she suggesting we can't share cultures, or is she suggesting that this is just another white man? But I was wondering what the reaction of the facilitators, the senior psychologist, was going to be, but they just kind of went, that's such a good point.
A day of whiteness training would have been one thing, but Simon says the whole 3-year course had been captured by that oppressed-oppressor obsession.
I remember thinking to myself, what does power mean, really? And sometimes you'd find this intersectionality wheel would come back again. White people having power, black people not having power, men having power, women not having power. And I remember just thinking, like, this is so limited.
Something stark was certainly being missed.
We were on the course for 3 years as a doctorate level course. A very responsible position was something we were being trained up to walk into when we finished, and yet we didn't really have a conversation on the whole 3 years about men's mental health.
Just going back to, I mean, in this 3-year course for clinical psychology, you're saying the discussions around men's mental health barely got a look in, despite the fact that there are some terrible mental health rates, and we all know that suicide's the biggest killer of men under about 45. Huge, profound needs around addiction, homelessness, self-abuse. Doesn't get a mention.
It was not talked about explicitly. We had a day on feminism. We'd had a day on intersectional feminism. There were so many different things we covered. We never covered men's mental health. We're going off into the world of the NHS and healthcare systems, not thinking about why are these problems happening for men. I felt pretty dehumanized. Just by uttering a few questions, people were immediately making judgments about who I was. I could feel people giving me a sort of cold shoulder. People who I'd gotten on well with before were now thinking, this guy, who is he exactly? Even just talking to you now, Tim, it brings things up for me, and it's not always completely easy to keep things straight in my head because there's a lot of emotion. Feeling that you're around people, feeling that you've put yourself into training for a profession that you've given so much of your time in.
I don't know how Simon made it through those 3 years, but why should he and others have to endure this? How does it help patients? Where are the gatekeepers? Why hasn't someone said, hold on, we're training mental health professionals. Let's keep ideology out of this. Let's focus on evidence-based approaches, and let's give a shit about men who are dying in shocking numbers. My go-to therapist, Carol Sherwood, has been hammering away at this for years. campaigning for the NHS and governing bodies to depoliticise therapy training and ditch the mandatory DEI policies imposed on clinical psychology training courses by NHS England.
This is not good for mental health. This is not good for anybody's mental health. Not only the people who are white, who are being accused of being, oppressors and dominant and bad, basically. It's not good for those in ethnic groups who are being told they're powerless to do anything about this because it's white people who are responsible, and they're just victims. In therapy, you would never tell somebody you're a victim. And you would never tell somebody that you have privilege and power and that what is happening in society is all your fault. So this is incredibly anti-therapeutic. What is happening now is so uncomfortable because we're having a theory or an ideology imposed on our society, both here and in the US in particular, which says that actually all white people are inherently racist. Now, we've not heard this before. This feels quite new. It has been around, this idea, since about the 70s or 80s, but it's now entered the mainstream.
When George Floyd died, Lee Chambers, the business psychologist in Lancashire, had a moment of hope. Change does sometimes come from opening up a conversation, he'd said, and there's no doubt that conversation exploded. Race was well and truly put on the map. Some good has undoubtedly followed. But could so much more have been achieved if companies and institutions hadn't been so dogmatic, so captured by divisive activism, if there'd been a conversation, not hectoring?
Like, even for the black community, we're not one homogenous group. There's massive diversity in the black community. But it, in some ways, turned us into this one group of people who all wanted the same thing, all thought the same way. And, yeah, well, you look like George Floyd, so you must be unhappy about this and you must want things to be this way.
If there'd been nuanced, targeted approaches to understanding deeply complex issues rather than simplistically seeing everything through the distorted prism of power.
It's about reducing the barriers and increasing the opportunity. It's not about prescribing that you need a certain percentage, because the biggest thing, Tim, is that's diversity, right? That's someone being measured on one demographic, i.e. she is a woman or she is black. It's not nice parties and cupcakes and celebrations and... Yeah, because that, if we're honest, even like awards and kind of shiny ceremonies, they don't change the life for people who work in a company. They look great externally. They're great PR. You might get a nice shiny trophy and get some lovely pictures to say we've done something. But it's not targeted.
In the next episode, 4 of White Men Can't Work, ditching meritocracy at multinationals is one thing, but to what extent has DEI affected our emergency services?
And I can remember that brief moment where I thought, I can chase after this guy. I stood still. And that wasn't how I was policed just a year earlier.
And the biggest consultancy firms in the world told companies that DEI was great for business. Quiz time. Was that A, excellent advice worth every penny of the millions paid? Or B, has anyone still got the receipt?
Often companies themselves don't want to know whether the things they are doing are effective. I think what happens is diversity training of this sort often makes white men especially defensive. Like, they don't want to be told that they're racist. Nobody thinks they're racist.
And all the shows are at timsamuels.com. If you're a fan of this sort of journalism, do subscribe to my channel on YouTube. Till next time.